This session is called Getting in Shape, Develop Your Customizations for On-Premises SharePoint. This is a continuation of the previous session, but the development side of it. If you missed the previous session, that's fine. You can watch it online later, or watch it on the videos later. My name is Cathy. Again, I'm a consultant by trade. I'm a designer by degree. I actually went to art school and not computer school. I'm a SharePoint MVP as well. Very lucky to be honored with that for the 4th year. I wrote on a SharePoint 2010 book, Cat Paint 1 on Twitter, and SharePoint Cat is my blog. If you didn't remember all of that, I have cards with that information on it at the front of the room. So what we're going to talk about in this session is we're going to talk about customizing design assets for SharePoint on premises. We're going to talk about customizing master pages first and the different options and methods for doing that. We're going to talk about customizing CSS. And then we're going to talk about deployment methods for on-premises, which is creating solutions and apps, and then we'll have some time for QA at the end. So just to kind of recap what we talked about in the last session for some of you that may not have been here, is we talked about doing the design process and what tools you would use for that. So we talked about gathering requirements, analyzing responses, producing use cases and user flows, discussing wireframes and creating those, doing those high fidelity mockups, which is the pretty pictures, and then developing that user experience asset plan. So in this particular session, we're going to talk about on-premises SharePoint. If you're interested in Office 365 and how to do this for that, I have a session tomorrow afternoon on that, so you'd want to come to that one. But this one is going to be for SharePoint on-premises, both 2010 and 2013. So I'm going to point out the places that things are different for 2010, and then I have some demos that we'll go through and show that for everything. But we're talking about and focusing on this. With 2010 and 2013 on-premises SharePoint, we can really kind of maintain control of our design so that others can't change it and modify it, that we are pushing out what we need when we need to do it. We can customize everything because we have the servers and we're updating them as we need them updated, not when someone else decides they need updated, and how we can extend that further. So first thing we're going to talk about is creating those different assets. As I said, we're going to talk about master pages. We're going to talk about doing a little bit about responsive and then things like team sites because they're a little bit different as to what we would create and when. We're going to talk about custom CSS. Oh, sorry, my image jumped behind there. But we're going to talk about custom JavaScript files and then things like custom apps and what we can do. So to start out, we're going to talk about master pages. Now, master pages are just what they kind of say by name. They're a master. Right? So anything that you want to appear in every site regardless, on every page, you would put into the master page. So this is things like logos and headers and navigation and those kinds of components. Those go into the master page. I want my footers, all of those kinds of ideas that are going to be everywhere regardless of where they are. That goes in a master page. We also have the ability to create what are called custom page layouts. That's defining, customizing the section of the page where our content is located. So things like creating 2 columns, 1 column, that center area of content is our page layout, and we can create custom ones in those as well. So the first method we're going to talk about when it comes to creating custom everything is 2013 only, and it's called the Design Manager. When Microsoft started releasing SharePoint 2013, they started talking about the new tool that they were giving us that was going to make branding a lot easier. And they told us they were putting something out called the Design Manager, and that Design Manager would allow you to take HTML developed by anyone, even an ad agency, and import it in, and it would work as your SharePoint intranet. Did anyone in the room hear that statement and believe it? Me either. So I like to put it as my little magic carpet writing guy because it's just that. It's magic that doesn't actually work. He's got strings somewhere. I just know it. So like I said, Design Manager is SharePoint 2013 on-premises only. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the Office 365 session. I kind of go into how you do that and how you import it and what each of those steps are. I don't personally feel it is hugely advantageous on an on-premises installation. If you are wanting to work with HTML, that is the way to get it in, but you then would work with an HTML file. It does not automatically translate HTML and CSS into SharePoint components. So when you import it in, you get it, and you kind of see this like upgrade, and you're like, oh, it doesn't look bad, and then you go look at the file, and none of your navigation or anything like that, SharePoint navigation, it's just your HTML at the bottom, and you have to go translate it all into SharePoint, right? You have to tell it which control it needs to be and add it all in there. So to me, it's just not where it needs to be. It's a magic carpet ride. It's with strings. SharePoint Designer is another tool that you can use to edit master pages. You can actually use any of these up here. I've actually used all of these to do SharePoint master page creation. I will tell you, as I said in the last session, my preferred method, I still use SharePoint Designer. Yes, it lost code view, or design view, it made us all sad. But I've been doing SharePoint for a while now. I don't like to tell how many years, too many. And I'm used to the code, so code view doesn't really bother me. But that's all we have moving forward is working with code, whether it be HTML if you're working in SharePoint 2013 or the .master if you're working in SharePoint 2010 or older. So having those tools, I still like SharePoint Designer because of the direct integration into it. I can open up my site and have access to my master page galleries and all of that. But I will tell you, it is design and development phase only. If I am moving to SharePoint for a production farm, it needs to move out of SharePoint Designer into something else to get packaged up, primarily into Visual Studio. Whether that is you or a developer, it needs to move out of SharePoint Designer before you deploy it. So that's why I typically, my method, SharePoint Designer until I get like 75 to 80% of the way done. Then I move to Visual Studio and I do my finalization and testing through Visual Studio, not through SharePoint Designer. So if we did so choose to import, we want to work with our HTML master pages instead of the .master file, you would go to the Design Manager and you can import your files in. And when you do that, you basically convert an HTML file to a SharePoint master page. And what it does when it comes out is it's going to give you will conversion successful or there are warnings and errors. And if it does give you the warnings and errors, actually click on it. It does give you helpful information for like the first time in history. SharePoint gave us something that was helpful. And it does actually tell you what line of code it is that you need to go correct. So you can go correct that and you move it in. And so we kind of go through and we can create that. You can also create just a minimal, basic HTML master page through Design Manager. So it actually goes through and does that. What it does is it creates two files. So when I import in or I create a minimal, it creates two master page files with the same file name. The difference is one is .html and one is .master. There's a direct correlation between the two. So if I'm editing in the HTML file, guess what? In the back end, it's actually converting those changes into that .master file because the .master file is what SharePoint uses to do the UX, not the HTML file. The HTML file is so that web developers who are comfortable with HTML don't have to learn how to use the master page. Right? So you can work through it through your desired program. If you're doing it in something like Dreamweaver, one of the methods that they tell you to do is to map like your master page gallery as a network drive to your computer, which in theory sounds really great. If you're a consultant like me, you maybe work with, I don't know, 20 customers at a time and maybe 20 different sites. It only lets you map one master page gallery at a time, so that's a real pain. But it also, if I'm working on an Apple, I have an Apple at home, doesn't like mapping drives that way, so that's kind of problematic. So that's why I still use SharePoint Designer. Or you can open the master page gallery in Windows Explorer view, and then you can drag between folders, but you can't save directly to it. So it depends on what you're comfortable doing with. There are lots of ways to do this. It's just what you're comfortable with and what your desired method is. I will tell you, if you are working with the HTML file, if you want to create your SharePoint using HTML, please, whatever you do, don't ever even open the .master file that has the same name. If you accidentally open that file and save a change into it, it invalidates your HTML file. And what you then have to go through, there is a way to reconnect it, but it's arduous and painful, and it even takes me about 2.5 hours to make it reconnect. So I tell people if you're wanting to use HTML, please don't even open the .master file. Okay? So you can go through and do that. Again, this is SharePoint 2013 only. We don't have HTML for SharePoint 2010. If you're doing the HTML files and you're using Design Manager to kind of manage those, in the Design Manager they actually have something called a preview page, which again, another very useful tool that they gave us that's most of the way there. But you can go through and preview what your customizations look like through there without having to actually apply it to your site, right? So I'm previewing things. But what I tell people is to create a couple of pages in your site, a couple of subsites or whatever, and create your own preview page. It allows you to add your own preview pages with URLs. And so that way, when I'm in that preview page section, I can scroll down and see what my actual content is going to look like in that. Again, it's without having to apply the branding to your site. You can do it through the preview pages, which is useful, right? Now, if you're working with HTML and you're wanting to use that for your master page, you do have to use what is known as the HTML code snippets that are found in Design Manager to create those SharePoint components as HTML. So you can see here, if you can, it's a little fuzzy, but you can read some of it. It's got things like top navigation and quick launch navigation and all these different components. You can customize some of them, apply your own CSS classes and things like that in the bar here, and then it gives you a section of code right here below that you cut and paste into your HTML file. These are great, except for the fact that they're a little bloated. They're like maybe 80 lines of HTML code for each control. So your HTML file is going to get very large. So if you're going to use these, please, please, please make sure you're commenting your HTML files so that you can find where these controls are if you need to change them or edit them or move them. Because, like I said, it's going to be like in Dreamweaver, like 80 lines of code in an HTML file for this. So you please, please, please comment.
So if these are 8 lines each, then you have performance problems on your reload page.
No, because SharePoint's not using the HTML file, it's using the .master file, which is why having that connection between the two is very, very important. It takes what you put in your HTML file and translates it over to that .master file, and then it runs based off the .master file.
Which is much longer than the HTML file.
You are correct. You maybe have 2 lines of code for the controls in the .master file where it's 80 lines of code in the HTML file. If you're working with the HTML, again, what you do when you import that in, you import your custom HTML in through the Design Manager, is going to have added in some divs to it right away that you'll need to make note of. Don't ever delete those. They're the really important things that they add in. Things like the ribbon and the main content placeholder. Those are added in, and those are where you start to move things around and put things in there. So you really kind of go through and do this and really kind of work with that HTML file. It takes a little bit of getting used to. It does, but you can do it, and you can go in and work with it very well. I know a lot of people that are loving this feature. Myself, I still just edit the .master file. It's what I've been doing for years, the file I'm most familiar with. I don't spend as much time in HTML as I did in years past because I work with SharePoint, right? So I'm not as comfortable with it, but I know a lot of people that love the HTML file. So it's all preference for you as to what you like to work with, whether it be HTML or the .master file. But again, if you're working with the HTML file, please, please, please don't even just pretend that one with the same name, .master, doesn't even exist in your master page gallery. Just ignore it. You'll be much better off if you do. Okay. So in there, with Design Manager, you also get the option to apply these very easily by going through and publishing those files at the end of the Design Manager features you've imported, you've customized. One of the last options it tells you to do is to publish and apply. And so you could go through, you have to actually publish the files so that they show up in the master page gallery, right? So if I got this custom master page and I put it through, I have to go to the master page gallery and publish it, just like we've always had to done. I still have to go do that there. And then I can apply it through the master page list under site settings if I've got publishing enabled. Or I could do it through a Sandboxed solution, which is what is created in that Design Manager field. And I would do that, you can use it Design Manager, SharePoint Designer, you can even create those in Visual Studio. It's a sandbox. I will tell you that Sandbox's solutions are great for 2010. They've been deprecated for 2013. But that use of that term deprecated for 2013 is kind of loose when it comes to branding because Design Manager creates a sandbox solution. So they came out and said, sandbox solutions are bad, don't use them, we're deprecating them, except for branding. And so you can still create sandbox solutions for branding files, but it is highly encouraged that you do not in 2013, even though Design Manager produces one. If you do use the Design Manager to do that, you're going to take the sandbox solution and add it into your solution gallery and activate it, and that will be how you apply your branding with the sandbox solution. It's not how we're going to do it later, but that's how you do it with a sandbox solution. Okay. So next we're going to talk about CSS. Does anyone in this room love CSS? A couple of you that do. This is the right product for you. I will tell you that I never knew how many different ways I knew to do something with CSS until I started working with SharePoint. And then as I move from version to version, it gets even better. My skills, I'm like a CSS ninja. I can move something position 12 different ways because I may have to use all 12 in that same CSS file for SharePoint. You can create as many CSS files as you like. I like to encourage people to keep the number of CSS files small. I like to say under 5. I will say that I have a solution that one of my team members built the other day that had 18 CSS files in it, and I was like, why, God, why? Why can't you just put them all together? It's harder to update if they've got that many, things like that. But a lot of times you'll have multiples, especially if you're doing a responsive site, because you may want to separate things out. But you can add a reference to your CSS, your custom CSS files in your custom master pages. You can also use the alternate CSS URL, which is through the publishing infrastructure, and put it just there if you have just one. I will say, fair warning, if you use SharePoint 2010, just please know to be careful with that alternate CSS URL in the site settings page under the publishing infrastructure. I will tell you that I have been gun shy to use it since the beta version of SharePoint 2010 came out, and it was so badly broken that I applied an alternate CSS URL and it killed my entire farm. Like not even recoverable, like had to rebuild. It killed the entire farm. And they keep telling me that that's fixed, and I know people that use that every day, but myself, I don't really like rebuilding entire farms, so I just don't use it. I just use a custom master page. Even if that's the only change in SharePoint 2010 I'm making in a master page is to add the CSS reference, I do that. With SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013, they've given us a great advantage in that they've given us the after call tag that we can use. And they've also reduced us down to where we can just use the link of the relative style sheet instead of having to use this plus the CSS registration, which we had to do in SharePoint 2007. 2007, you had to know the secret decoder ring story of where to put which one in what order of the head tag of the master page for it to apply your branding last. Now we can actually tell it when to apply our branding in an order through the CSS reference. That's one version. You can use that one. With 2013, I prefer to use the CSS registration because it gives me a lot of different options. So you see here is that after call tag, right? So I can really specify when I want my files called. CSS is the thing that allows you to take SharePoint the furthest and not looking like SharePoint. Colors, fonts, images, positioning. You can also take it, what I like to say, one step further. While this specific reference here is SharePoint 2013 only, the same idea applied in SharePoint 2010. This goes to what's known as themable CSS. So a lot of times, did any of you work with SharePoint 2007? A couple of you, a lot of you. So in SharePoint 2007, you would go in and you'd open that, core.css file, and you'd just groan because it's like 20,000 lines of CSS that mean nothing. And let's be honest, the names of the classes mean nothing. They mean nothing to us. They mean something to some developer that wrote them. And so in 2010, you opened up the core v4.css, and you thought for half a second, oh, they commented it. And then your dreams were suddenly dashed when you realized that, no, that was just the themable CSS references. In 2013, we have the same thing. But they've taken those themable CSS references and made them better. And how they've made them better is they've actually started to give them names. So here, the font is, the name of it is title. So I can actually create my own custom CSS that uses this replace font theme font title. And I can use that to call and change my own CSS styles. You could not really write your own custom themable CSS with SharePoint 2010. You could, but it was really painful, and the syntax was really poor, and you had to do all that. Now I can just reference based off this name. So I can create my own classes and say I want it to be like title. And it will actually pull the CSS for title and the attributes assigned to title and use those to style that CSS call. So now I can actually shorten down what I'm writing as far as my custom CSS by utilizing some of these. The great thing about these is that if you're using composed looks and you're putting those in to do your coloring and some of that, it inherits it, so it implies it everywhere. So the other great thing that we can do now with SharePoint 2013, I'm sad to say with SharePoint 2010, we're still in the Stone Ages. With SharePoint 2013, they have actually made it so that it supports CSS 3.0 and HTML5. Goodness, we've moved up to the modern era. We're not stuck in 1998 anymore. But I will say, if you're wanting to use HTML5 and you go into the master page and you try to put that HTML5 boilerplate in the head tag like you would do in a normal website, it will barf on you. Doesn't like it. So you don't have to put the HTML5 boilerplate in the head tag of your master page for it to be HTML5 compliant. It's in there somewhere in some deep, dark, hidden, locked file that they've got that in there, and they've put it in there, and so we don't have to. If you put it in there, you will actually get that really great unexpected error, something went wrong screen, and you have to go figure out what it is. We've also moved up to CSS 3.0 in SharePoint 2013. In SharePoint 2010, you're actually still on 2.35. Did you even know there was a CSS 2.35? There was. Microsoft found it, and they're stuck there. We can add links to things from our master page, additional JavaScript, script links, CSS, all of that. We can add some of those same things, JavaScript, CSS, all of that in content editor web parts, alternate CSS URLs. We can actually even apply any of the frameworks for making sites responsive through SharePoint 2013 in the master page. They work really well. Bootstrap is my personal favorite. It works the best to me. Now, I've used the others, but it works the best to me. The other great thing we can do in SharePoint 2013, you could do this with SharePoint 2010, but it's a little bit more complicated. You have to do a few more of these. But I've actually made an entire site of SharePoint 2013 responsive using just adding the Bootstrap framework into the master page file and CSS. I had to do nothing else, right? But you can do it with responsive, what are called CSS media queries. And it's all CSS, and we go through and we define things, customizations to make sites responsive based off of a query and a parameter. So basically, we're defining our media type. Here is the screen, being that we're putting it on the web. This is the same thing we used to do if we had to write print-specific CSS back in the olden years, right? So media is the screen, and then we're defining a query, right? So for here, our minimum width is 1024 pixels. So anytime the screen is at a minimum 1024 or higher, anything that I put below that in my CSS file would apply. So I would have one that's maybe media screen, max width of 504 kind of thing for phone. And then I would have one that's maybe max width of 728 or min width of 728. And so you define out your screen types based off resolution of size. And then you put it together and you put those in your CSS file and you go through and it will respond and adjust based off of what you've got. It's really great, easy thing to do. You can do it all in one CSS file. Yes?
Did you actually get to look okay? Because it might try this box with the left nav and with the search box.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't had any issues. I mean, you have to do a lot of massaging and you have to define some of these in between to get those to move right where you really want it to. It's not just, I like to tell people when you're doing responsive that you're typically defining like 3 or 4 device breaks is what they call them. With this, for some of those things, you may have to have 6. I may have to have one that's specifically there for left navigation. In fact, though, but when I move to responsive, I typically don't show the left navigation. Because I'll tell you why in a minute when we talk about responsive, but there's a time and a place for responsive when it comes to SharePoint. And so typically I'm hiding the left navigation, and then search is the only one that has that offside parameter. The other big thing that you can do this in either one, but it's becoming more and more prevalent with SharePoint 2013, is using JavaScript and JQuery to do things. This is where you can actually have a file that targets something specifically and change things using JavaScript. It's not just for image rotators anymore, right? It's not just for those custom web parts and displays. In fact, in SharePoint 2013, the SharePoint Online, Office 365, our nemesis. If you're a user experience designer and you're working with Office 365, it is your nemesis. You will fight it every day. They do things like use what's called JavaScript injection, which is a JavaScript file that contains things like CSS prefixes or suffixes or new CSS classes. And it goes out and it looks for where that old CSS class was, and then it changes it on the fly at runtime using JavaScript, right? So this is how, if you're working with SharePoint Online, we do things like customize that stupid sweet bar app launcher thing. The sweet bar before, now it's the app launcher with the little waffle icon in the top left corner. So that's how we can customize those, is because we insert, through JavaScript injection, our own CSS classes onto it. Now, they will change every 2 weeks, but we can try. It's a great battle. Where do I actually put JavaScript? You can put them in a lot of places, and this applies to 2010 and 2013. If you want it to be accessed by all sites, you would put it in something like your style library or your master page gallery, because those are galleries that are accessible by all locations. If I want it to be used in a specific site, I would maybe put it in a library, a specific library in that site. Now, the tricky thing about this is permissions. If everyone needs to have access to it, I typically stick it in the style library or the master page gallery, because those have permissions for everyone to be able to read those, or else no one would ever see our images. No one would ever see anything like that. If we're putting it in a library specific to the site, you have to make sure that the people that are accessing that site have permissions to at least read the items in that library. Even if you hide that library from navigation, they have to be able to read the contents of that library, or the file won't run. So if I have custom JavaScript, what do I do with it? Well, we can have an app for it. You can use the script editor web part. You can use the content editor web part, but the script editor web part in SharePoint 2013 is better. You would use the content editor web part in SharePoint 2010. You could reference custom JavaScript in your custom page layouts. You can also reference custom JavaScript in your master pages. So think about things. This is one of the scenarios that I like to tell people that you could kind of go through. One of the most common things that I use JavaScript for in a site is to do things like put a network alert for everyone that says things like, the office will be closed for this holiday, or something like that, and to have it appear for a time frame and go away. I typically use JavaScript for that, and I target it in my master page, and I change the file out when it's needed. So if there's nothing needed, I put a blank JavaScript file that says close the gap, uses CSS to close the padding and the spacing of that location. Then when I need to put in an alert, I edit the JavaScript file to go in and expand it out and put that in there. So I'm putting the reference to it in my master page, but then I'm targeting just through that JavaScript file what goes into it. You can do that based off of a list. So you can have it read from a list and read things like expiration dates and appearance dates. Depends on what you're looking to do, how often you're looking to do it, and who's updating it. Another thing that I've had people ask me to do is to do things like put in, when you're accessing the site, especially on-premises installations, from outside of the network. So if I'm logging into the URL and I'm coming into the site and I need to have network access to get some of the custom application links and things like that are in there, but I'm just going through the browser, to have it say you're accessing this from off network, and it does that by looking at what IP it's coming from and some of those properties, to then put a bar across the top that says you're accessing from off the network, some links may have limited functionality. just to remind their users with that visual cue that some things don't work right. And that's all done through JavaScript. Okay. Deploy it, get in there, darn cat. How do I get it in there? So applying it, again, publishing infrastructure is great for development environments. This is like your Wild West, I'm swinging in on a zip line kind of thing. I want to get in there, do it fast, and see what it does. This is when you activate publishing for your sites, and then you would go through site settings and go to the look and feel and add in your custom master pages and all of that and apply them from there. It's great for development environments. As I said, not great for production, and I'll go through a little bit more why. Other simple dev application, again, publishing using the alternate CSS URL, or you using a Sandboxed solution in any of the 3 methods. I'll skip that one. Full trust solutions is what, in my opinion, is still the best method for an on-premises branding installation, whether it be 2010 or 2013. The reason for this is it gives me full controls of the files and how they are applied to my sites. I am using code to go in and tell it to change the custom master page URL to the one that I'm giving it. I'm putting those files in locations. I'm maintaining them. I have source control over it. I have all of this, right? It makes it managed code that's easy for us to update and apply. What a SharePoint full trust solution does for branding is it creates a feature. So when we go to site settings and we have either site collection features or site features, we have those things that we can activate. This gives us a feature that we can go in and activate that will apply our branding. We can scope it at web app level, we can scope it at site collection level, and we can even scope it down to individual site level. But it gives us the ability to go in and deploy this and activate that feature and it apply the branding throughout. It gives us the greatest control. Someone who goes in and does branding, I don't want somebody, I call it mucking around with my design, going in and changing the master page or adding in a theme or anything that could override it by using publishing. I want it to be what we defined it to be, what's been approved, what's corporate approved, and it's in there, and stay that way until I decide to change it. And so I use features for that because you activate them, and then even if they have publishing turned on and they go through that look and feel master page and pick a different one, it doesn't apply it. Ours is overridden because it is done through code, and it says this is the only master page that is allowed, right? So how do I get rid of people mucking around with my stuff? I use a solution. Okay. For SharePoint 2013, we also have the ability to deploy branding using apps. I'm not a fan. You can do it. It is the best method to do it if you're online. Again, still not a fan, even though I'm forced to use it. The app model is hard for me to grasp as a designer, I'm going to be honest. Understanding how it works and where I need to put things and what I need to write to make an app run. I usually miss something and I have to call a developer and be like, can you help me? I can't figure out what I've done wrong. And I send them my solution file and they're like, oh, it's just this. And I'm like, it's hard for me to understand. It changes all the time. And that's the other piece that's hard for me. You can get a sample of how to do it from the Patterns and Practices site on GitHub, which again, it's hard for me. I'm a designer. I don't like GitHub. I had to actually make somebody from Microsoft like do a screen share with me and show me how to use it. I didn't know. I'm not a developer. I'm a designer. And so you can get that. They update them frequently, but they do work. How do they work? They basically take what we have, we install the app, it goes out to a provider-hosted location and finds the files that we've told it to add, and it pushes them into our farm so that they can be applied. Right. Basic app structure here. You go through and you define this out. I have to say, this is not the part that confuses me because this is very much like the solutions. And I'll show you a sample Visual Studio solution for those full trust solutions. And I have downloadable samples of those that work for 2010 and 2013 as well. And so it's just kind of defining out what you want and then going from there. The other great thing about on-premises is that I can actually use Powershell to do branding. How many people in the room like Powershell? Did you know you could use it to do branding? Yeah. So you can use it to do branding. So we not only do things like add and install our solutions using PowerShell, but we can also do things like reset our master pages or set master pages through PowerShell. So this is a useful one if you've ever had one of those really bad unexpected errors that you can't get that master page to reset. You know, you set both system and application master page, system and site master has an error in it. How do I get it out? You can use PowerShell to go through and reset it back to one of the default ones so that you can actually go back into your site and fix your errors and then reapply. So PowerShell is a great little tool for that. And then in SharePoint 2013 on premises, you have the sweep bar, which Microsoft lovingly gave us, that has the word SharePoint in the top left corner. And I don't know about you, but a lot of places that I go into and work with them, they've had 2007 SharePoint sites or something like that, and they were really bad. And their users kind of have a bad taste in their mouth for the word SharePoint. And so they want to name it what they're going to call their intranet, portal, whatever. And they go in and they install this and it says SharePoint. What do? We use PowerShell to change that. And I can't tell you how many Microsoft employees, MCS and PFEs and all of that have called me in the last years to ask me how you change that. And you use PowerShell. It's not CSS. It's not hardcore branding in the master page. It's PowerShell, people. And so you go through and you basically get the web app and then you add your text. You can put CSS around it too, so you can style what that text is, how far it's padded in, and so forth. But you use PowerShell to do that, which is a great thing to have. Okay. We went through a lot of stuff really quickly. But before I go into demos, does anybody have any questions? No? You just want to see it? Okay. Let's see what I can get going here. Do we want to start with 2010 or 2013? Any preference? 13? Fantastic. Okay. So, as you can see, oh no, you can't see because it's on the wrong screen. Hold on. Let's fix that. That's not it. Oh, now you can see it. I still use SharePoint Designer, even for 2013. So this is the .master file, not the HTML file. I'll show you an HTML file here shortly. But in this master file, it looks very much like you would see the master file in previous versions. Close this down. Close away, friend. There you go. So it looks very much like you had before, except there's no design view, right? So our code is still there. We have all of these pieces at the top that kind of go through the pieces that we don't need. One of the things that I like to tell people to pay attention to is what your XUA compatible type is, especially if you're working with old legacy browsers like IE8. Okay? If you're working with IE8, you want to make sure that you either have a secondary one. Edge works on 8. It basically tells it what level of compatibility to work with from a browser type. But if you're struggling with one of those old browser types, pay attention to your UA compatible line in your master page. Let me scroll down a little bit. So in here you'll see I have a lot of JavaScript files. My mouse is moving. I have a lot of JavaScript files that are referenced here. I know my mouse keeps drifting, it's on the podium. And I have them all linked up. I have the Bootstrap framework applied to it. And you'll notice I have them all put in the style library, so all those JavaScript files are accessible by any site. And their Bootstrap is the primary piece that I've put in there to make this site responsive. I've got Google Analytics added to it right here. Because you know, everybody needs to have a little Google Analytics on their site. This one actually we added in another Eloqua, which is a different type of tracking that basically records more information about page views and browser types and locations. So we put that one in there. And then down below it is where all of my CSS files live. So here, all of my CSS files, as you can see, there's quite a few of them. And then below that, I have a little bit of giant old IE8 support compatibility for HTML5 elements. It's just a few pieces in there that don't work the same. Some of the gradients and rounded corner references that we have that didn't work in IE8, and so we just put something in there that tells it where to go out and pull some of those HTML5 JavaScript files if they're in those old browsers. Okay. So that's kind of the basic stuff in the head tag. I'm going to show you the site so you can see what we've done with it. I'm actually just going to show it to you in online because it works. So here's my site. As you can see, same design I would apply to my on-premises master page I've applied here. It works quite well. I've added in, wow, you guys can't see any of that, can you? Let's try that. That's a little bit better. So you can see I've got in, the different customization components. It's got a header, navigation, search has been changed up. We've added in different web part headers and stylings on the different items and gone through and done that. This site is responsive, so when I do make it smaller, you see things like the menu change to that hamburger menu, and then you can expand that out. So it is a responsive site. You see my quick launch moved over to a hamburger menu. I will tell you that when you're looking at designing a responsive SharePoint site, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Responsive is great, and it's the way of the future, right? Everything needs to be responsive, except for the fact that team sites, document libraries, and lists are really bad ideas to try to make responsive. Why? Because no matter what Microsoft tells us about how they made SharePoint non-table-based, it's div-based. They lie, they lie, they lie, they lie. Their pants are on fire. I don't know how they sit down. They are really bad about that. They have tables everywhere. They're just not hidden where we can see them. They're about 3 or 4 or 5, 6 levels deep in all of those things like document libraries, and so you really have to dig to find them, but document libraries and lists are still very heavily table-based. So what I tell people in looking at going responsive is what you would want to do is use responsive web design for anything that is a publishing section of your site. Okay? Then you would want to use a fluid width standard SharePoint master page for anything that is team collaboration, basically anything non-publishing. That includes search. Search is not, the Search Center in SharePoint 2013 is not great when it moves into responsive. It still has some of those crazy things involved in it that just don't like to do it. So publishing only for responsive in SharePoint 2013. They keep telling me they're going to make those, and I tell them that I have some great waterfront property in the middle of the country that I would sell to them, like oceanfront. If they ever do that, I will give it to them for free. So I don't feel like I'm ever going to lose this bet because they're never going to do it. So publishing only for responsive. It does work great. This one has got the JavaScript framework on it. The only customizations in the master page to make this responsive is adding in those bootstrap frameworks, and then I added in the control around the navigation components to tell it to make it this menu. Everything else is all done with CSS. Right? So that's what the changes are in our master page. Again, very minimal in the master page. I have a few things like adding in some headers and some custom things. This one actually has some custom navigation controls features that aren't being used here. Just adding in a few custom things like that, but that's it. The big piece of it is in the CSS. Now, with CSS, I always tell people, however many files you create, whatever, as long as you comment them, you're good, right? And don't comment it with what the technical term is for the piece. Comment it with what makes sense to you. If you call it quick launch, you call it left nav, comment it with that. Because you're going to leave your CSS alone, you're going to finish it, and you're going to go away for like 6 months, and somebody's going to say, can you change that color? And you're going to have to go in and do that. And you're never going to remember where it is. And you're going to be like, that's what I call it. I need to find it. I'll find for that. The other thing I like to do is I like to put a list of the hexadecimal colors being used in my site. If I have fonts, I would put them in here too. So that if I do come back and the company rebrands and they change all their colors and they don't want to redesign it, they just want the colors updated, I can do a find and replace based off that hexadecimal color in my entire style sheet by knowing what they were and what I'm changing them to. And then I don't have to remember them. I just quick search on it, find and replace, change them all out. Okay. So you can see here, very standard SharePoint CSS. Nothing exceptionally crazy here. I'm going to go down to some of those responsive media queries so that you can see them. Here's some of them. I don't know if it's better for me to highlight it or not highlight it. So here is a media query here, and you see that I've defined it for custom global nav breakpoint to collapse the navigation. And the media query, which I'm going to have to unhighlight it for you for that to see, says that it's for any time the media is a max width of 991 pixels. So it's anything below 991 pixels, these CSS classes get applied to it. So you see you do the @media, you could put screen in there, but it's not needed anymore. Max width of 991, and then you do an open curly bracket. And then anything within that curly bracket gets that applied to it. I end it, and then I move on to my next one. So you take the same exact CSS classes you're using before and defining for your full width, and you take the ones that you need to have changes to make it responsive, and you put them inside your media query, and they'll apply. Make sense? Seem useful? I love these. I use them all the time, and I can get down to just having like 2 CSS files for my entire implementation with this. I have one that uses them and one that doesn't, and that's for fixed width and fluid width kind of idea. As you can see, there's a fair amount of those in here as I go through for the different pieces. This one's for max width of 630, max width of 480, max width of 340. Depending on my device type, I go through and do them and define them out. Once you define out what your breakpoints are, which is what those are called, stick to them and use them repeatedly, unless you need to offshoot for something like the quick launch and the search bar. They don't go quite the same way that the others do. They don't follow the grid format. Make sense? Nice to see, easy to use. So I'm going to show you what a feature looks like in here. Let's see. Go to one of these other sites. I have too many. So I'm just going to kind of show you where those are. I would go into site settings. The site, move that back over. So here's site settings, and I want to manage site features. Get a little smaller again. Move it over. Okay, so then you can go through, and I scroll down. It should be down here at the bottom somewhere. There they are. Here's the 2 custom ones for this particular one. I have an alternate site collection master page. Remember that if you were in the first session, I talked about the one where it was the extra navigation. That's what this is. And then here's the branding application. So this is what's been applied to apply the CSS, the JavaScript, the master page, and everything. I simply come through and activate it, and it applies the feature. Right. You can also write these so that when you deactivate it, it removes all of the files. This particular one was not written like that. They didn't want somebody to accidentally deactivate it and change the scheme. So they wanted the files to stay in place until someone intentionally went in and changed the master page file. But you can write it so when you hit deactivate, it retracts everything and sets it back to like Seattle or whatever you want it to. That same stuff applies for 2010. Any questions about any of that? Anything you want to see or have questions about for SharePoint 2013, master pages and CSS? No? Okay. Let's look at some 2010 then. Let's hope it's still in here. So unfortunately, it's really small because it's a remote desktop session. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to get it as big as I can for you. Because it's small for me. Okay. So in here, SharePoint Designer again, I have a master page. Again, remember in SharePoint Designer 2010, we still had design view, right? Great, we could click in there. I always tended to use regular master page view, but same things in here, link to custom CSS, JavaScript, all those kinds of things were added in here. Putting all of the same kinds of concepts you would do in SharePoint 2013, you could do in SharePoint 2010. The same thing with the CSS. Again, like I said, comment it to what makes sense to you. Add your custom list at the top. Those same principles apply going here. The big change here, and what I'm going to show you to go along with this, is what a sample solution file looks like in Visual Studio to package these up. Let's see if I can make that a little smaller for you so you can see all of it. So in Visual Studio, you would create a solution file, and you'll see over here on the right-hand side, there's a whole system of files here. This is where you put your things in your folders. This is how they get deployed into the Hive. Okay? So this is that 15, 14, 13 root folder that you go into, that Hive folder. We put our files there, and we update them there. So one version of the truth goes into the Hive using a solution, and then we update those Hive versions, okay? So when we go through and we add all our files in there, CSS, master pages, page layouts, images, scripts, all of that, we define where we want them to go, what folders we want them to go in that left-hand side area. That's how we set it up. We then create what's called an elements.xml file. And that's what this is, and this is how we define what those files are, where they're being applied, and how they're being applied. So you can see in here, I have a master page that's the custom one, and then I'm going to scroll over a little bit so you can see it, because one of the important things in here is if you see out here next to it, where the URL for what it is named is, the next little piece that says type, and it says ghostable in library. Now, we all know when we're working with SharePoint, we have to go put it in the master page gallery, right, and publish it for us to be able to use it for that site. By making it ghostable in library is where we are keeping our main version of that file in the Hive, and we're putting a kind of link to version in the libraries, right? So I update it once by updating this solution. I don't have to go replace that file in every master page gallery out there. The solution looks for it in the Hive. So that's kind of the important piece on that one. And it goes through and sets it out. This one was actually written for 2010. That's why I did the demo with this part. So you can see UI version there is for value 4. Content type ID, I'm setting it, telling it it's a master page. Then below here are my layout pages. And so I go through and I name them all out and give them. And this is what I define as the items that need to go into that master page gallery for us to use them. I go through in some of my other scripting, and it's having a lot of warnings and errors over here for me, but where I go through and I tell it how to deploy it, where to deploy it. I could tell it based off of if its publishing infrastructure is applied to do that. You can tell it how to create new sites using it. You can do all kinds of things by writing more code to go along with this to deploy the different master pages in different ways. We're at 4 minutes left. Do we want to see one of the HTML files? Do we want to do questions? Maybe a little of both. Anybody have any questions while I open one of the 2013 HTML files? Yes, go ahead.
Hacked the SharePoint Designer 2010 to work with SharePoint 2013.
They are not.
Did it take off a security update or something to work?
So, yes and no. It doesn't like it, and I try my best not to use old versions with it. It just doesn't like them. I'm gonna actually open a different site for that. It's not really backwards compatible or forward compatible. I will also say that this is just me off the record, not being told by anyone, not under NDA, because they wouldn't tell me even if they knew. I don't anticipate there being another version of SharePoint Designer. I think it's going away. So I don't think when 2016 comes out, we'll have a version of SharePoint Designer, so it'll be even less of a problem. I think they're going to move us. They're really pushing me to use more Visual Studio to do branding, which I don't like. I'm not a fan. Not a fan.
You say Visual Studio, do you mean C something?
I mean the application, Visual Studio, to develop my CSS files, my master page files, all of that.
You don't do any C something?
Very little. So here is the HTML file. You'll notice there's a lot more stuff that's grayed out, basically commented out in this. And then you kind of go through and look some of these items that are things for the different pieces and components. All these little commented out sections are part of those code snippets. And so going through and pulling those out, like here is the code snippet for the site icon for basically the logo that's in the top left corner. In the regular master page, it's one line. So 1 to, 15 kind of thing. This is the navigation control below this. That's the navigation control. So I will say, though, that if you are in 2013, this is a little helpful hint for you. If you're in 2013 and you want to have a breadcrumb, and you need to add a breadcrumb in there, the breadcrumb control from the master page of SharePoint 2010 will actually work in SharePoint 2013 if you're editing the .master file. So you can actually take the breadcrumb that existed in 2010 and copy that into your master page file for 2013, and the breadcrumb will show back up. So if you need a breadcrumb, that's an easy way to do it instead of customizing it. So the HTML file, like I said, it is HTML. It's very useful, but it's overloaded with code snippets. Comment it, start and end. So I can Google, I can search for find in navigation and take me to that line, because they don't collapse well in any program. That actually puts us at the end of our time. So I want to thank you very much for coming in.